Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 17, Section 2, The Age of Exploration, the First Global Economic Systems. So, as we go along, make sure you're jotting down the things that you need. Number one, when individual merchants wanted to invest in exploration, they often combined their resources in what is known as a joint stock company. These are organizations that sold stocks and ventures. So if I wanted to perhaps maybe get rich off of the work of some of our explorers, if they happen to find, let's say, gold in the Americas, I would get a small portion of the goods that these explorers would find if I bought into their exploration, meaning that I would put money up front and support them in their journey. But whatever they would bring back, I would get a little portion of. And so this was, in a way, kind of like an investment, no different than maybe the way that people invest in stocks on Wall Street today. And number two, during the 1600s, the greatest increase in trade took place in four countries bordering the Atlantic Ocean. That would be Portugal, Spain, England, and finally the Netherlands, or the Dutch. Number three, mercantilism. This was an economic policy that held that a state's power depended upon its wealth, and thus the goal of every nation was to become as wealthy as possible. That might mean that some countries tried to establish what I would call um, monopolistic trading rights with a certain area. So, for example, when we talk about the 13 colonies here in the Americas, Great Britain, for the most part, held a monopoly because the only merchants that were allowed to sell goods to the colonies were British. Okay, not to say that the people living in the colonies were exclusively buying their products from England, but if they happened to buy from some other vendor who was not British, it would be basically an illegal trade. So they bought something from the Dutch or something from, let's say, the Spaniards if they were living closer to Florida. That would not necessarily be something that the British would approve of. And number four, the amount of a nation's wealth was measured in something known as bullion. This is gold, the amount of gold or silver that a nation possessed. In a way, our monetary system that we have in the United States is kind of based on this to a certain degree. You know, the American dollar gets its value from gold that we have in reserve, and in a way, that's kind of a nod back to this idea. And number five, the transfer of products between the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa is known as the Columbian Exchange. Sometimes it's also known as triangular trade. So if you take a look at the map that's off to the right, you see that there's kind of like looks like the fin of a shark. It's kind of like a triangle. And this kind of tells us a little bit about how trade was taking place between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And a lot of times it would be like the trading of guns to Africa in exchange for slaves that would be sent to the Americas. And eventually, whatever agricultural product that is going to be produced in the Americas would eventually go back to Great Britain. And it kind of works like that. Now, granted, there were a few other little exchanges that happened as well, but this becomes kind of the go-to trade formula, basically starting in the 1500s up until probably the 1800s. So when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, mercantilism, and capitalism, these are all trade patterns. So looking at each of these in a little bit more detail, when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, this is the widespread exchange of plants, animals, and disease between societies of Europe and the Americas. So plants like tomatoes are not native grown in Europe, but they were grown here in the Americas. And eventually those items are going to be taken back to Europe. Certain animals like horses were not found in the Americas, but were eventually brought to the Americas and eventually, did very well. When we talk about diseases like smallpox, were pretty much unheard of in the Americas. And thus, when these diseases unknowingly came over with some of our explorers, eventually the peoples in the Americas fell prey to that. So the effects also were felt in places like Africa and Asia as well. Mercantilism is a system based on the idea that a nation's strength depended upon its wealth, and it needed favorable balance of trade to make that happen. Colonies help provide new markets or raw materials and, new markets. Capitalism. This is a system in which most economic activity is carried on by private individuals or organizations seeking a profit. It is really kind of the model that we have here in the United States. When we go out, we make a purchase, in a way, we're kind of voting. We're voting with our dollars. And finally, the joint stock company. These were examples of capitalism in the colonies. If I had money that I wanted to invest, I could buy stock in these companies with the hopes that maybe our explorers would come back with new products and goods that could eventually be sold and profits would be made off of that. Thank you very much.